Good evening and welcome. This is the People's Platform. Nelson Mandela once said that there is no keener revelation of a society's soul than the way in which it treats its children. It is a pivotal responsibility of the state to ensure a life of dignity to the child. The Constitution of Sri Lanka in Article 27(13) says, "The state shall promote with special care the interests of children and youth so as to ensure their full development, physical, mental, moral, religious and social, and to protect them from exploitation and discrimination." How far have we achieved this? Let's discuss the status of children, vulnerable persons. Today our guest joining us on our program is Emeritus Professor of Pediatrics, Founder Chairperson of the National Child Protection Authority, Professor Harendra De Silva. Good evening and welcome. Good evening. Professor De Silva, as a precursor to this conversation on ensuring the best protection of children, could you outline the adverse impacts on children who are the most vulnerable in society? The adverse impacts of the economic crisis have further heightened or exacerbated how children are impacted by this. So speak to us about the varying issues that have now been further heightened as a result of this crisis and otherwise.
I think it's important to understand that the child is also a human being. They are not a separate or different entity. So when you are talking about human rights, child rights is a part of that. We can't keep these in two containers. No, that's human rights, this is child rights, these are two different things. No, it is the same. So when there is a violation of whatever, what we are talking about, when you talk about adults' human rights violation, the same principles apply to the child. So only difference is the adult can protest, but the child cannot. So we as adults should protest by proxy in favor of the children. So that is, those are the people who are called child rights activists, and the other side may call them madmen or madwomen, but still that is the whole responsibility of the whole population, not necessarily the activists. They are just stimulants. So the whole community, including the family, has to look after the rights of the child. So I think in terms of the adverse effects of child abuse or violence against children, so I'm using the word violence because it can be sexual violence, physical violence and emotional violence. These are all detrimental to the child's development. So what I am saying is that it's important that there is a lot of study on this impact in childhood. So the younger the child, the adverse effects on the child gets embedded in the brain, especially the hypothalamic area, amygdala and those areas in the brain which is also called the reptilian brain, which gets embedded and actually results in is part of the adult violent activity, because children who face violence in childhood and also maybe during adolescence are the people who tend to become violent in adult life. In other words, I used to say that today's abuse becomes tomorrow's abuser. So that actually is well documented. It's not what I have discovered, it's well documented. I just coined the phrase. So I think it's important that we understand this and look into it so that the child is free of violence of whatever nature, even emotional violence, scolding a child, finding fault with the child for nothing and all that. So I think in the face of the whole issues of corona and then previously the Easter bomb, the corona and now the economic crisis, the adults in the families are stressed out. Stressed out because of partly the economic issues, partly sometimes the stress that they have to face in the workplace, loss of jobs, again related to the economic issues and the food crisis and so on, and then also the violence in the community as such. General people face violence in the community. So, all those reasons make the adults stressed out. Now, that stress is transferred onto the family. For example, a stressed father will start barking at the wife, who then retorts maybe, and there is domestic violence, not necessarily physical, but through words which the child faces, and the child faces that, and that itself could harm the child in many ways. And then the stressed out mother would also be violent maybe to the child because she is stressed. I am not trying to justify it or whatever. So, she is also stressed. So, that has an impact. And then of course, it may be because the father did not have money to buy some food for the child, and then there is an argument and then all that, but it impacts the child as well, especially if the arguments and the fights are in the presence of the child. So, these are issues that can happen, but at the same time certain issues such as the right to education, for example, which is part of the Child Rights Convention, Article 28, when the child is deprived, of course, when it is not possible physically, it is maybe justified, can be justified about Zoom classes, but we cannot make use of those as excuses to shut down schools, or it may be some other reason, but then some of these things are justified using another reason. So, I think ensuring the children's physical participation, which is more important than Zoom participation, Zoom is better than nothing, but is important because the children interact, and then children get used to the screen, which is also detrimental to the child, and then in the middle of the Zoom class you might go into a game which again can harm the child. So, all these things have long term psychological impacts on the child. So, I mean it is very varied. I mean I can go on for hours describing each one, but basically the child is affected in many ways, and once a child is affected, he carries on as an adult with the same way that what he has faced during childhood.
All right, thank you very much. Professor, the key stakeholder that has been vested with the responsibility of ensuring and enabling child protection is the National Child Protection Authority, the NCPA. However, if we connect it with the budgetary allocation, last year it was a measly 40 million rupees that the NCPA was allocated to conduct all of its activities, from awareness programs in 3 different languages across the country to conducting investigations and all its other work to go behind perpetrators of violence of children, etc. Interestingly, the NCPA had asked for 175 million rupees to conduct all its activities, but was only allocated 40 million rupees. When we take this matter of child protection, sometimes something that we see is that stakeholders work in isolation or in silos. There is no coordination, there is no multi-sectoral engagement, as a result of which there are half-baked policies which are formulated. How do you view this, having worked in this area of child protection for several decades, Professor?
I think the main purpose of establishing the Child Protection Authority, which started with the Child Protection Task Force, Presidential Task Force on Child Protection, of which I was the chairman, and then I was also the first chairman of the NCPA. The whole purpose was to get all these stakeholders to coordinate, and then for the National Child Protection Authority to decide on policy, which is one of the main things, and then also ensuring that other stakeholders also work in a way. And that is the reason why it was under the president, because there was a clout there, right? But then subsequently there were other stakeholders who wanted to take over, dilute the power of the NCPA. For example, I am not blaming these people, but
Sure.
for example, these are territories people from, the territorial nature of animals, but human beings in a way, Homo sapiens, is that the probation and child care wanted part of that glory, and they took away some of it. And then the police conducting investigations by the NCPA was diluted by the other police people taking over and depriving these people or stopping them from doing that part of it. Then the Ministry of Women's Affairs and Child Affairs, so they took over some of the tasks. So actually the clout of the NCPA was lost.
Right, right.
And of course, in terms of the members, you were talking about half-baked policies and so on. We should have definitely professionals who are committed, right, to the thing and who understand the problem, who have experience in the problem, but not necessarily. I am not saying all are that, but sometimes what we have is these are political appointments or favorites and so on and so forth, because the appointment process has got in a different way. I think what should happen is it should not be even under a sort of a ministry, but as an independent authority, because that independence is important. We can't bow down to pressure from politicians. When I was chairman, I have had several calls from different powerful people, and I never gave in, right. And then when they get the news that they can't influence, they will not call you, right. So that is important. So the independence of the body, the multi-sectoral involvement, then the appointments having very committed, professional, knowledgeable people who take decisions on policy, all that has to happen. It just becomes another white elephant. The normal problem we are talking about, SOE, it may apply to this as well if you are not working. So I think, for example, the investigations that we used to carry out those days are not happening now. They are not happening. It's not happening, right? Because on one hand, the overall police does not want these people to do it. I can go into detail of how these things evolve, but I don't need to go into detail. But that is my assessment of the whole problem. So independence of the NCPA is absolutely important, and resources. If you think of one or two or even one bulletproof vehicle for a politician, right, that is 170 million or more, right. Why? Children are sacrificed. Here we are covering the whole country, all the children in the country, safeguarding them from death, injury, assault, all that. But then we spend the same amount or more on a bulletproof vehicle to save one person. I am not saying it is not important, but just look at the logic of it.
Okay. When we speak of child protection and the subject of child abuse, we are talking about the physical, mental, sexual abuse as well as neglect.
Yes.
I'd like to discuss this issue of corporal punishment, cruelty to children. Multiple incidents were reported of children being beaten to death, tied to trees. This is also done by some school teachers, and this violence is so normalized. Corporal punishment is so normalized. How do we as a society move away from these myths surrounding myths surrounding corporal punishment? Look, if a child is beaten, he or she will be better as an adult or whatever.
No, I think it's important because this is a intergenerational issue. If the parent or the teacher has been beaten as a child, when the person was beaten, it was justified, right?
Yeah.
And that justification continues throughout life, right, on one hand. On the other hand, when he was beaten, there was, as I said, there was some impact on the primitive brain at that point, what is called the reptilian brain.
Okay.
So when you get angry as an adult, you cannot cope using what we call mindfulness or thinking about it using the frontal cortex. We just react through that same process because we already have justifications. So, we get angry, just smack the fellow or say a bad word, shoot it out, and so many things can happen. So, those are cycles that need to be broken, and that we need to identify that as an issue. Just bringing in laws will not happen, because if you take for example, corporal punishment is justified by parents, many parents, corporal punishment is justified by teachers, it is justified by the police, it is justified by the public, and it is justified by politicians, not all, many. So, it is not going to happen just because the UN says under a particular section, or under the penal code revision 22nd revision of 1995, 308 says cruelty to children. But then again, the problem about that law is it's not applied. I think it was applied only once in the whole system from 1995 to today, right. It was implemented only once. Why is it not implemented? You think there is no cruelty? Because we did a study in 2017 or 18 for the NCPA, and we found that there was cruelty to children, both emotional and physical, in terms of 85% of the children. It was an island-wide study, right, and it is published in an international journal not long ago, just 4 or 5 years ago, right. So, it happens and it is justified, and that justification is across the board. And just because the UN shouts, we formulate something, but then there are lots of loopholes in the definition of what cruelty is, right, and then it goes to court, is challenged, police, it gets challenged at different points.
Yeah.
You get beaten at school, you complain to the father, you say, damn good, you deserve it. And then he goes and complains to the principal, he says, no, this is how it should happen. So, then you go to the police, again it is justified. You go to the Attorney General's department because it is under the penal code. So, one of the things is the draconian nature of that thing, just giving a small smack, how it is treated as a penal code offence is a bit of a problem. So, there has to be, it has to be fleshed out,
right,
and then these different aspects should be taken out in terms of definitions and categorization of that. Of course, if somebody hits a kid with a bat or something on the head, that should go into a penal code,
sure,
but not necessarily other one. Then what happens is overall nobody gets punished. So, if somebody gets punished in the lower court and gets into the record, his record, whatever, in the school, whatever, or sacked, then it will stop. So, I think one is that in terms of stopping it is going to take a long time, but strategies and commitment is important, right. First of all, the awareness has to be created. That is a long process, awareness to all different sections of society. Then the skills of teachers and parents and other people. What happens when a child, how do you punish a child? Right now, we did 200,000 books just for teachers, right, in 2003 or 4, right, and it was distributed, some were destroyed, whatever, by the teachers and so on, but still it is valid. So, now that, how do you deal with the problem? When you are faced with a child who has fought with each other, how do you deal with it? That is a problem.
Yeah.
So, that awareness has to be coming, those technical skills have to come into parents, teachers, everybody. Then the implementation of the law is the other aspect. So, if the law is not implemented either in a domestic level, in a school level, there should be some sort of accountability.
Yeah.
I mean, 1920s and 30s, there was a law that came up where a principal could hit a child with a cane. But then again, the diameter of the cane was specified, the cane could not be raised above the ear, and then a female student can be hit by a male. And so there were so many things, but even that is not implemented. You just, so that is part of the your childhood experience and your attitudes to the problem.
Yeah.
So you can't just change a law or whatever and then say, right, corporal punishment is no. I mean, you can ban corporal punishment in this country, but it doesn't mean it. I mean, even in other countries, like say for example Sweden, they banned it 50 years ago. Corporal punishment was banned 50 years ago.
Okay.
However, there are sporadic cases here and there. Again, maybe that reptilian brain working where somebody breaks a fuse and then hammers the child, but not in a very bad way, but they are punished in some way or the other, not necessarily jail terms. Here, if a child faces corporal punishment, the minimum punishment under cruelty is 2 years, RI. So, will it happen? You see, the judge is going to say, right, you have hit this boy with a cane and you go into jail 2 years. It is not going to happen. So, of course, 1995 we all agitated and all that and whatever, and we pushed for these, and we were very happy when there was rigorous imprisonment for corporal punishment, but it was not corporal punishment, it was cruelty to children.
Yeah.
Right. That is a different story. Right. Anyway.
Yeah. So, ending cycles of violence, intergenerational cycles of violence, and over and above the laws, we need to also think about creating this attitudinal shift in society. You spoke about awareness, creating awareness. Speak to us, Professor, about how the education system also can contribute to this awareness creation. Given the fact that in Sri Lanka we don't really have comprehensive sexuality education, parents are unaware of how to best protect their children, parents are unaware of how harsh words hurt and negatively impact children. These basic simple things that we as a society are unaware of.
Harsh words, I must clarify this, harsh words not necessarily only hurt children, but it permanently damages, right, the brain, not in terms of scars, but the chemical nature, there is chemistry inside the brain, all these impulses go through chemical mediators. So, that changes, and that may remain dormant and then break out at a point.
Yeah, when you humiliate, ridicule a child without knowing what you are doing to the child.
So I think it's important. So, it's basically number one is awareness. So, you need to have a huge awareness campaign. Now, for example, during my time I had poster campaigns, we had TV campaigns and so on and so forth, billboards and so on. Now, most of them don't exist now. I don't know what they are doing, but I don't see it happening. At the same time, the state has to have some sort of a commitment. I can remember when I went to the state broadcasting corporate, not Rupavahini, and wanted 30-second slots for various cartoons and so on, educating people about corporal punishment and so on and so forth. So, we made these skits also, and then they just simply said we need 30,000 rupees for 30 seconds, right, and that is then, this is now 2000, well, I don't know how much you charge now. So, the commitment of the state is not necessarily profit, but there was no commitment at that stage. I don't know what the commitment is. So, you see, protecting children, you have to consider it as an investment, and to invest you have to sacrifice profit, right. So, and I think as part of CSR programs, even companies like you should sort of allocate a certain amount of your time, right, maybe peak time, maybe sometimes peak time, just 10 seconds maybe just for a small cartoon which gives a sort of a a message to people.
Absolutely.
So that policy has to be developed by the NCPA. If there is no policy being developed at the level of the NCPA or strategies developed there, then it will not happen. But at the same time, if you want to do it, and if the state or the private sector or the commercial sector is not willing to sacrifice, then again you can't say. So, the awareness is the key. That awareness is linked to development of skills. Now, what, like for example, you know that child abuse is bad or corporal punishment is bad, then if so, what are the alternatives? Those are the skills that you give. What happens, counting to 10 and breathing hard and things like that. Those skills have to develop in at home as well as in schools. Now, if those skills are not for that again, it's part of awareness. You have to do a process through which you need to make those changes. Okay. And then the implementation of the law, again commitment by the government, which is important. And you can't say we have bigger problems than looking into children who are smacked here and there, right? But that is important because that's the next generation who are going to be violent because they face violence in childhood, right? So, long-sighted processes, do not happen. It's for today, how to solve this problem today, how to make a quick buck today is what matters in this society at this moment because of insecurity in the whole system. So, I think it is the long sight and policy especially is important.
All right. In Sri Lanka, when we talk about child protection and preventing, curbing child abuse, Sri Lankans tend to have a reactive approach as opposed to a preventative approach. So, after we wait till after a child is molested or abused or assaulted, and then we run to the police station and to the court system and to psychologists and psychiatrists and counselors. How do we move from a reactive approach to a preventative approach, Professor?
That again depends on the awareness and the policies that are developed, right? It's partly revenge. In the sense, if somebody has abused your child, you want to get it out of that guy, someone other, right? So, which is fair enough, but that is the thing that pushes you at that point, but it becomes the colloquial term like soda bottle, that you open that and then it fizzles out after a while, right? And then what happens is the court system dampens that. The enthusiasm that is created at that point, the court system delays. I hope this is not going to be contempt of court, but what happens is, AG's department takes such a long time, then it gets postponed, and the defense lawyers, I know you are a lawyer, always the issue is to delay it as much as possible, and then it gets so long drawn out, the complainants get fed up. They are mothers now, they are maybe even grandparents, I don't know. I mean, it's gone on for so long and they just get fed up, and then they don't come to courts, and then the case is thrown out. So, the famous saying, justice delayed is justice denied, applies here. So, I think it has to be rapid. I know we investigated, there was a pedophile who came to Sri Lanka trying to abuse children. So, I developed a system and caught him, arrested him, and then the British police, Scotland Yard, filed a case against him in England. So, we had to go to UK, few of us had to go to give evidence in that particular case. So, what happened there was that they sat down and finished the case within 3 days, that is it, right. And here it's 3 months, 4 months, 6 months, then court holidays, whatever, it doesn't, justice is denied. That is all done on purpose, let me say that, not by the judiciary, but usually by the defense. That is a strategy that is used to delay the cases, not necessarily abuse, not necessarily criminal cases, even civil cases. That is how the court system works, and people have accepted it. It is a norm. The top people also benefit from it. The policy makers, the lawmakers of the country will benefit from that, no, because there are cases against them as well. So that is, I mean, if a case is heard in a week or so and finished off, right, we will not have so many parliamentarians sitting there anyway.
We are in conversation with Professor Harindra De Silva. We're going for a short commercial break. We'll be right back. Welcome back. You're with the People's Platform. We're discussing the responsibility of the state to ensure a life of dignity for the child. We're in conversation with Professor Harindra De Silva, Emeritus Professor of Pediatrics, Founder Chairman of the National Child Protection Authority. Professor De Silva, we have 15 minutes and let's talk about solutions or the best way forward in child protection. How must the country's policies be streamlined to ensure the welfare and protection of children? We have a regulatory framework, we have an investigative arm, we have a justice system, but we keep hearing of cases of child abuse, sexual abuse, molestation, cruelty to children, neglect. And this is so rampant. However, it's not a priority for the government. For successive governments, child protection has not been a priority. Where do we go from here?
I think we have enough and more laws for child protection. In fact, it may be even draconian, especially the 1995 Penal Code Amendment number 22, which may need some changes, not necessarily trying to free people, but to make it more practical, right. That is the first thing. The laws in the country may have to change to some extent. I know the changes are more important than introducing new laws,
right.
I mean, corporate punishment, you do not need a new law, just change what is there in the section 308A and then clarify that and make changes there. So, I mean, not only one, there are so many. So, that is one part of it. I think again, I do not know, people might laugh at me maybe, but I think the principles of good governance applies here as well. First of all, now the lack of conflicts of interest, right, is important. Now, supposing whether it is a police, the National Child Protection Authority, the Aegis Department or the judiciary, right, there should not be conflicts of interest, right. So, it should apply separately. For example, if you take the NCPA, if you are I mean, you may say that I was a political appointee because I was appointed by the president, but I did not know the president at that time at all. I was just appointed on what I had done. But still, if there is a political, if it is a political appointment, right, you may be obliged to the person who appointed you in terms of keeping your job and keeping being stable to be influenced, right. I am not saying it is happening, but that weakness is there. Then if you take, for example, police promotions and so on is dependent on another person, again there is a conflict of interest. The same applies to Aegis Department or judiciary or whoever, right. So, those conflicts of interest should go. So, it is then again that is where the system change comes, right. Now, people are talking about system change only in relation to politicians. It is wrong. It should apply across the board even to families, right. Because even families, we saw how the three-wheeler drivers stole the petrol and diesel and then sold and all that, So, it applies, it should apply, So, then the other thing is about transparency. Whatever we do in terms of investigations, arrests, whatever, we should be transparent. It does not necessarily mean we have some information of a pedophile network, we do not tell the police and be transparent, the press, and then be transparent straight away. But once the investigation is done and once the facts are presented, we need to be very transparent how it was done. It was not due to somebody else's influence or somebody is pressurized, whatever. Then the rule of the law should work in terms of lack of impunity, right. So, again it is the same thing, right. Now, those things should get into the system. Now, those systems are not in the system. We have the law.
Yeah.
We say the law is there, but the implementation of the law is not there, right. So, that is again the system change we need, the implementation irrespective of whoever is responsible. I mean, during my time even politicians were arrested, right. There was nothing, I mean they may have been government based or whoever, it was not an issue for anyone, right. It was just offence was committed irrespective of the position of the person, school teachers, principals, priests of many religions, not one religion, they were all arrested and prosecuted, right. So, I think it's that's what is needed. One is that, you know, if let us say somebody was abused sexually as a child, he may have a tendency to abuse people because of these changes in his hypothalamic area. He will have a tendency to be an abuser, right. So, that can be stopped only through fear of prosecution, right. You can educate that person how not to do it and so on, but what happened in the past cannot be changed, but at the same time it cannot be justified, right. So, I think the implementation of the law, lack of impunity in the whole system of good governance is important. I mean, good governance is not a romantic phrase that is used. That is what happened in 2015, it was just a romanticization of it, but of course, there were few things like the 19th Amendment and the RTI Act,
Yes.
Right to Information Act. Those are RTI is basically transparency, right. So, there were some aspects that were done, but at the same time within that same group there were people who did not want it to happen. So, unless you are bold enough, the leadership is bold enough, if I want you to be accountable, that is the other word that is used, if I want the person at the lower level to be accountable, I too have to be accountable, right. You can't have the top being not accountable and only the bottom be accountable, then it becomes a dictatorship. The dictatorship will always make the bottom of the pyramid or the base of the pyramid accountable, while the top is not accountable at all, right. So, I think it's important for people to understand this, right. We have to be, even at the base of the pyramid, we have to be accountable, there is no doubt about it, not provided, that is true, but the top also has to be accountable. They also have to be transparent. They can't negotiate with various people and keep it hidden. The results of the negotiations can't be hidden. You have to put it out to the people. People have to see that. That's transparency. So, I don't know how we are going to bring about a system change. A lot of the people who are talking about system change may not understand what system change is, right, because it has to be across the board.
Another important issue that we need to discuss before wrapping up is this issue of nutrition. This is also another area of expertise of yours. Sri Lanka is facing a severe issue pertaining to food insecurity. Children are facing malnutrition according to reports that were released. Expectant mothers are also facing an issue in this respect. Speak to us about how this works, nutrition, the intersectionality with the economic crisis, etc. What do we do?
I think it's a long discussion. I don't think we have time for the full discussion, but very from a bird's eye view. We have two sections, like the international community saying something and the government and some of the maybe doctors trying to protect that view. right?
Okay.
And that is called denial. Like, you just hide your head in sand and say it doesn't exist, right? You have to be objective.
Right.
Both sides have to be objective without pointing fingers at each other,
Okay.
right? Now, it is important that given the fact that there is a shortage of imports, there is a shortage of production partly because of the organic issue, right? Therefore, the food security in the country is limited. So, therefore, it can be assumed that children will get malnourished or getting malnourished. But the UN usually would probably look at the food, they know the food security situation, they use that part, they use the logic of malnutrition of there, and also look at the imports and exports and all sorts of things like that, and then sort of formulate that this is going to happen. Whether it is still there or not is another issue, right. Then the other issue is that we already had a baseline level of malnutrition.
Okay.
Like around 20%, right, either undernourished or stunted about 15-16%, right, which was there for decades, and it has not changed, right. So, if you just do a cross sectional study in a clinic or somewhere, you are going to get those figures anyway, but that does not mean it is because of shortage.
Okay.
But at the same time, we can't deny the fact that there is probably impending malnutrition at points, and also it depends on the social structure, economic structure of the families.
Okay.
On one hand, the middle class and the upper middle class and the upper class, the children will be obese.
Yeah.
They can become more obese in a way, right, in spite of all economic issues. On the other hand, at the lower level, the wasting and the stunting will happen, right. So, what we do not have is that we have to develop an action plan based on data.
Right.
So, we need data, and we need to do a proper study or studies. I am used to doing that in a big way. I did island wide study of about 10 years ago, and so that will show where the malnutrition is and whether there is impending malnutrition or it has started to go down. For example, children, if you look at the growth charts, a lot of people are aware of it, there are these parallel lines in the growth chart, and we have to see whether this child is deviating from that because of the food shortage, and you do not have to go to the severe malnutrition state to start acting. So, as the moment the child is deviating, we have to take action. I do not, in a way, I mean, of course, giving food, distributing food, it is partly because of the culture of the country where, this so called ping business, giving for the next birth and so on and so forth, because we have that tendency to give. But that has to be done scientifically. For example, if there is an emergency situation where there is severe malnutrition in a particular area, yes, it has to happen quickly. But at another level, it has to happen in a way to prevent it from happening,
Sure.
and to address the impending malnutrition or the slight deviation in the nutritional status, depending on the group. So, we need to identify it. So, the international community should be maybe able to fund it, government should be able to coordinate it, but of course, in a very scientific way, right.
Okay.
And so on and so forth. So, I think if there is going to be aid given for food, right, first of all emergency aid for where there is malnutrition, second for intermediary to prevent intermediary, and third long term, which should mean also giving fertilizers, producing food, seeds, and then machinery and the know-how, right. That should be the long term aid, not just giving dollars to the country which may be used for other things, right. So, I think the international community should understand that this aid business need not necessarily be a spot on thing or just once and for all thing, but also long drawn out mid term and so on. Now, mid term will be seeds, fertilizer and increase production and equipment maybe, right. Know-how and all that and continued processes would be again that, and then food security in a way can be prevented. Now, for example, if we have ways of about 40% of the food that is produced is lost, it decays because of storage issues. So, but we have never thought of, or we have started at one point, but it has not caught on refrigeration facilities in the periphery, drying of foods, canning of foods in the periphery, right, preventing the rotting of foods and so on and so forth, and then preserving it not necessarily for export, but for consumption elsewhere.
Absolutely. Last 2 minutes of the show, what is your message to the minister who has been vested with the responsibility of child protection? Because you spoke about accountability, and we see how child protection is not really prioritized. In 2 minutes, how can we hold the minister in charge accountable to ensure child protection in Sri Lanka?
It's not an easy task. Anyway, I think again the same thing is allowing the systems, NCPA, police, judiciary, attorney general, but to work independently without any interference. And if there is interference, take action, right. That is crucial. Then allocate more money for awareness programs and skills development programs. Now, those things can be done. We started on that. Of course, I had just 6 years and we just started the ball rolling, but then some of those things have stopped, right. So, that is to change attitudes of people, awareness of people and so on, and this is not going to happen overnight. Maybe you will not be, or the minister will not be in power at the time when the changes happen, but you can be happy. Now, for example, awareness on child abuse, I am the first one who described child abuse in this country, right. I am happy, although nothing has happened, right. I am happy that I have made people aware that there is something called that, right. Now, it is sort of 25 years down the line. So, I think so these are little things, but of course, you need to flesh out the details of what a minister can do.
All right. Thank you very much, Professor Harendra De Silva. Thank you for joining us on this edition of the People's Platform. Thank you for watching us. We'll see you again on Monday with the Sinhala edition of the People's Platform. Good night.